First, Dr. Parthare, Director, National Institute of Bank Management, NIBM Pune, a former professor of economics at Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, during 2007-11. He was advisor to Executive Director India at the IMF, Washington, DC. Earlier, he was working in the specialist cadre of economists in RBI Economic Research Department during 1989-2006 in a various capacity. He was Director, Department of Economics and Policy Research, RBI. He has written extensively on the issues relating to monetary policy, banking, and finance. His edited book, BRICS, The Quest for Inclusive Growth, Volume 1 of 3-volume book set, The Political Economy of the BRICS Countries, published in 2020. Welcome, sir. Our second speaker, Dr. Kavita Rao, is the Director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, New Delhi. She has received her PhD in economics from Indian Statistical Institute, ISI Kolkata, and her master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics. Dr. Rao was a visiting scholar at Department of Economics, Cornell University, on a Ford Foundation during her postdoctoral fellowship. Her research interests include design and implementation of goods and sales tax, GST in India, methodology for assessing the comprehensive impact of various tax exemptions on the economy, sectoral interlinkage and their implications in the planning a growth strategy. Welcome, ma'am. Our third speaker, Dr. Pradeep Apte, is a council member of Indian Council of Social Science Research, ICSSR, former professor of emeritus at Savitribai Phule, Pune University and Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, and served as a visiting faculty at a numerous academic and corporate institute, including Ferguson College, ICSI Training Institute, the Institute of Management Development and Research, Symbiosis Institute of Business Management, World Trade Center. His area of expertise are operational research, econometrics, international trade and finance, public economics, taxation, and agriculture economics. Welcome, sir. And our last speaker, Dr. Subhashish Gangopadhyay, is the founder and research director of Indian Development Foundation in New Delhi. He graduated in economics from Presidency College, Kolkata, and received PhD in economics from Cornell University in 1983. In 2006, he was awarded a doctorate by the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. He is also a professor of emerging market finance at the University of Groningen, Netherlands, and visiting professor Gothenburg University, Sweden. Dr. Gangopadhyay has also been the member of South Asia Chief Economist Advisory Council of the World Bank and advisor to the Competition Commission of India, CCI, on the board of Center Analytic Finance, Indian School of Business. Gangopadhyay has served on the board of Industrial Reconstruction Bank of India, IRBI, as a member of the Reserve Bank of India Advisory Group on bankruptcy law and the Bankruptcy Task Force, IPD, Columbia University. Welcome, sir. Today's chairperson is Dr. Ajit Ranade, is Vice Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Without further ado, I hand over to Ajit Ranade, sir. Over to you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal, and a very good morning to all of you. May I request to all of you to give a round of applause to our eminent panelists. Thank you, thank you. So I'm delighted to welcome you this morning for, I think this is, Vishal, the 8th edition or 9th? This is the 8th edition of our post-budget event, which is held at Gokhale Institute and in partnership with at least 5 or 4 different organizations, Pune International Center, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, National Institute of Bank Management, India Development Foundation. So we are continuing this tradition, and we of course have a very stellar panel, as Dr. Vishal mentioned and described their bios to you. My job is to sort of get the flight off the ground. So I'll make a few preliminary announcements, like please tighten your seatbelt and be comfortable. I have already requested my panelists to confine their comments each, because the budget is a vast subject and there's a lot to say, but we want to leave enough time for an interaction with you all, especially students and especially the backbenchers. Please come forward because there are a lot of seats in the middle. So we want to leave enough time. So I've requested the panelists to confine their comments to perhaps 10 to 12 minutes each to leave enough time for interaction. You know, the budget this year was presented in the backdrop of three things. So these are just my initial comments. That as a backdrop to this year's budget, the budget, as you know, is just a proposal. The budget is just a prediction. It is a Marathi मध्ये म्हणतात प्रस्ताव. And that proposal has to be approved by parliament, because not even a single rupee can be spent by the government without the approval of the people. And people's approval comes from people's representatives, Loka Pratinidhi, and that is the parliamentary process. But because the BJP has absolute majority in the Lok Sabha, the lower house, whatever is presented by the finance minister, she is a member of the ruling party, that is automatically approved. I'm just putting it simplistically, but because you might say if the proposal is there, then it should be debated, there will be dissent, there will be disagreement, but that usually won't happen because an absolute majority passage in Lok Sabha means the bill is approved, the budget is approved. It does not need to pass in the upper house, which is the Rajya Sabha. Rajya Sabha, people can comment on it, can critique it, can criticize it, but it just needs to, when I say it, I'm referring to the finance bill. That's what the union budget is called. So presentation of the budget in that sense becomes a formality, because it's not as if it's going to be thoroughly, you know, like torn apart and really debated. It's going to be presented to you as a package, unless there is a huge backlash in the country. But more about that later. However, that should not give you the impression that kuch bhi chalega, you know. She can, you know, the finance minister can throw chocolates or do completely reckless things. Aisa nahi chalega, because each of the members of even the ruling party have to ultimately go and face their constituencies. So they are answerable to the people. So therefore, it has to be a logical and reasonable budget. Beyond that, it also has to make macroeconomic sense. So anyway, I'll leave it to the panelists to describe all that. But I think the backdrop to this budget were three things. One is the macroeconomic context in the world, the context of the world itself. The world is undergoing a recession. Okay. On top of the recession, there is also this Ukraine war, which seems to be endless. On February 24, it will enter into the second year. The US is already sending tanks. Some people, you know, sort of kind of in, you know, I don't know, sarcastically, or they have said the US will fight this war until the last Ukrainian. But that was, you know, it was kind of a, so this war, we don't know how it's going and where it's going. But what it has done is it has created a lot of disruptions. It has created a huge inflationary spike in the prices of crude oil and also food prices, not only wheat, but even rice price of, you know, other food commodities have gone up. And that is impacting people all around the world, in countries in Africa, countries in East Asia, countries like India. So the inflationary impact of the war and the impact of shortages is being felt. So that, and of course, because of the recessionary environment, the outlook for capital flows, which India is dependent on, or export prospects are that much weaker. So this is the first macro context. The second macro context, according to me, in context to the budget, is that India has been undergoing a good recovery. We had something like, say, I don't know, 7% growth, and next year is maybe 6%. But this growth seems to be uneven because it is benefiting people at the higher end of expenditures much more than at the lower end. For example, Mercedes cars growth sales record last year in 2022 was 41% growth. I think Lamborghini also, which is a car which I don't think most people buy, they had record sales growth in India. Most of the luxury cars are booming, but two-wheeler sales of two-wheelers, you know, scooters and so on, they have been declining for 3 years in a row. If you look at consumer staples, that is also stagnating. So this is what is called a K-shaped recovery. There's an upper part of the K and lower part of the K. Most of the population is in the lower part. So the upper part of the K, which is luxury cars, flats, you know, just this morning I read in the Times of India that in Mumbai, how many flats is it? 1,200 crores in one building. I think 20 flats, I don't know, were sold in one go. Worth 1,200 crores. So luxury cars, real estate, airline travel, five-star hotels, tourism, that is really booming. Outbound travel, even the stock market. Again, you know, who is invested in the stock market? People who have money or who have savings. Only 3% of India is invested in the stock market, and So that perhaps that part of the economy is doing well, and that's reflected in the high growth rate. But is it benefiting the, is it evenly spread? Is it equitable? So that's the second macro context. First is global recessionary environment. Second is the uneven growth, the K-shaped recovery, which I think is in the third year. And the third context, of course, is the fiscal situation. India is a very, even though our population is young and we sometimes don't seem to worry about the fiscal deficit is high. But if you look at it in the context of how much we are paying for interest payments and how much of the revenue of the government simply goes to pay interest on the debt, and the debt is mounting, it's a very worrying situation. So the finance minister had to do a very tough balancing act. In the first case, provide resilience to against global recession. In the second case, to provide some kind of redistribution and relief to the lower part of the K. And in the third part, to tighten the belt and have some fiscal consolidation. So we'll find out how she has done. And I invite my first panelist, Professor Partha Ray, to give his initial remarks. Thank you.
The economic survey, not in the budget, economic survey is somewhat apologetic in terms of startups leaving the country. We all hear India has been a really, a land of the startups. And that they ascribe this in a phenomenon of flipping, which is a process, and I quote, transferring the entire ownership of an Indian company to an overseas entity, accompanied by a transfer of all IP and data owned by the Indian company. This notion of flipping, this phenomenon of flipping is somewhat surprising given the fact we had very impressive numbers in terms of World Bank doing business indicators. Let me come to the basic fiscal arithmetic. In terms of fiscal arithmetic, one is really, as I pointed out, I have taken both in terms of percent of GDP as well as the composition. There has been indeed been an impressive record in terms of the deficit numbers, and that too in an election year in deficit number. Therefore, we thought one should look deeper. When the deficit numbers is unchanged, you need to seek at least either the revenue has gone up or expenditure have come down, or perhaps both. So in order to look at that, I sort of try to see is where does the added capital expenditure it comes from. So next please. So if you look at the added, there has been huge reduction in the central sector schemes. I mean, in terms of central sector schemes revenue expenditure, the number that I've arrived at is something like a reduction of 1,37,000 crore. That's a major reduction in central sector schemes. So what it does essentially in terms of, are we seeing some kind of creative accounting? Are we seeing something like fiscal, at least the central sector schemes have been suffering to that extent? We look purely in the variation in expenditure pattern, and then you look while there has been an increase in various things, other expenditure, there has been a reduction of nearly 1 lakh crore. And therefore, the question is, what has happened? Now, I'm not very clear on this, and therefore I'm sharing my confusion, but my reading of the budget is, what was earlier was purely seen as grants in aid in terms of revenue budget has been shifted to kind of interest-free loan, long-term interest-free loan with bullet payments. As a result of which you say an increase in capital expenditure, but at the same time, your revenue deficit is under control. Therefore, in some way, will the devil lie in detail? Next one. So I'll end this. I was looking at least one interview by former Chief Statistician Pranab Sen, who sort of pointed out that this increase in 33% increase in capital investment to around 10 lakh crores, amounting to 3.3%, there could be elements of creativity there. Why? A substantial part of this increase has happened by reducing the capex of PSUs. It could be 1.3 lakh crore to the states on a 50-year loan. May not be an increase in capex, but simply a change in the source of funding from earlier the grants to the current capex. And earlier even the grants, the center was dictating the states. Now even in terms of the capex, these will be somewhat tied. And some of these 10 lakh crores may not be capex at all, depending on how BSNL and BPCL utilize this additional 83,000 crore. It is almost certain that perhaps up to 50% of the capex increase could allocation to railways and highways might not be used. Why then is the announcement? End of it, it captures the headlines, and a large proportion of this could, if it is not utilized, will provide sufficient cushioning in the calculation of fiscal deficit. To conclude, therefore, it's an interesting budget. To me, it's almost like last year's budget. Government perhaps did not walk into the trap of an election year budget, but certain claims of very reduced fiscal deficit or huge increase in capital expenditure, one needs to see much more details. At this juncture, therefore, I'm somewhat ambivalent as far as these are concerned. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Partha Ray. You raised some interesting questions, and you know the purpose of this session. That's an important point is called, and then the capex point is also very important. In fact, much has been made about the fact that this year, out of the 40 lakh crores, 40 trillion rupees is the size of the budget, and 10 trillion rupees, 1/4 of it is capital expenditure, which goes to number was 7.5 lakh crores. The actual expenditure was 7.28. So even the fully allocated budgeted amount was not able to be spent because the government does not have that kind of absorption capacity. So on 7.28, it looks like a 33% increase, but we need to look at these numbers carefully. And then of course I was mentioning to Professor Subhashish that this 2.04 lakh crores in railways, whether how that is going to happen, but we'll come to that later. I'd like to invite now Professor Kavita Rao from NIPFP. We would have liked her to be here in person, but she could not be, so she'll be on video. So over to you, Dr. Kavita.
Thank you very much. I think I'm at a loss partly for being so far away. I sort of could hear part of what Dr. Ray mentioned, but let me try and put on the table what my thoughts for the budget are. So I think the first important thing, taking off from what Professor Ranade said, is it's important to keep in mind that fiscal consolidation is on track. Interest payments as a percentage of total expenditure last year was 22%, which is huge, and it's expected to increase in the budget of this year. So that is a worrisome indicator, and therefore fiscal consolidation being on track and a commitment for 4.5 in 2 years down the line is therefore mightily welcome. What I would add to that, however, is there's a bit of a backloading of the commitment. Given the context of the budget, I think that is to be expected. So that is the first issue that I thought I would flag. The second, obviously, everybody needs to talk about it because the budget gives a lot of prominence to the fact that CapEx has been bumped up 33%. While I'm sort of in agreement with all that the panelists are saying, I would still suggest that the amount of adjustment that the government has made in revenue expenditure last year, given the need to step up its food program and given the need to spend more on fertilizer and petroleum, it still chose to spend a bulk of the amount that it proposed to spend on CapEx. So the focus seems to be to push CapEx and maintain the targets for CapEx rather than let CapEx slide and find resources for revenue expenditure. So that is one dimension I think we should keep in mind. While there might be slippages, I think the attempt would be to keep CapEx going. If it's not in one sector, it will perhaps be reallocated to another sector where spending is going well. So that's how I would look at it. Where I find a challenge is would CapEx result in employment, which seems to be our old story of doing CapEx and that's stimulating the economy. Most of the CapEx that's suggested is not likely to generate employment. All that the government seeks to spend on PM Awas, I guess, will have some employment implications. it should be kept in mind that compared to RE for last year, the government is not proposing to spend a whole lot more. It is a comparison to B that gives this 66% increase. So that component is likely to see some stimulus to employment, but all the roads and the railways are likely to see more capital intensive investment. And in that sense, it is perhaps a stimulus to the sectors which produce inputs for these activities, these infrastructure investments, rather than employment. So in terms of consumption boost, I'm not very clear how effective it is. It is considered a golden rule to spend more on capex than on revenue expenditure, but that is a challenge that we are looking at. The third element, which I already mentioned, is we have concerns about whether allocations for NREGA will be enough. We have concerns about variety of other sectors, whether the allocations would be enough. And I would expect government to be reallocating within revenue expenditure, which is in the aggregate fiscally prudent and in the disaggregate sort of non-transparent. So that is the trade-off we seem to be looking at. Turning to taxes, which is a little bit of an area that I like to look at. The share of taxes that the states would receive is pegged at 30% once again. This basically means that the state's concerns regarding how much government raises by way of non-shareable levies, excises, as well as surcharges and cesses continues to remain high. This is good from the union government's point of view because it leaves more space to do to accommodate expenditures and to reach your fiscal deficit target. But from the state's point of view, we are where we were. And that is an issue to keep in mind going forward. In terms of the changes in taxes, we continue to tinker with customs duties with some short-term or some sector-specific objective or the other. We don't see major broad themes emerging from the budget. In the direct taxes, however, there is this push to transition away from an exemption-based regime to one which doesn't have, where people choose to adopt lower tax rates along with exemptions. There are two ways of looking at it. One is to say that fewer exemptions are always better. Because we can't always target, there are not enough people using them, and exemptions deliver benefits only to the people who are already paying tax, and therefore we should do away with these, and which is a logic that I would normally prescribe to. The big question is, as long as you keep two regimes in place, it's important to figure out who is going to adopt the new regime. Even if we call it default, as long as the options are available, it's important to figure out who's going to adopt the new regime. And here it appears that the push is to get people in the lower income brackets to adopt the new regime. It can be considered benevolent by raising the exemption threshold to 7 lakhs, which with rebate, that's what it's going to be. But it also has this implication of excluding a large number of people from the tax net. And then our gripe about very few people paying income tax in India continues to rule roost. So it is important to ask ourselves whether people are willing to pay small amounts of tax to be a part of the system. Would that be a better description of the Indian economy as against the drive to push more and more people out of the tax system? So that is a concern that I think we should be looking at more closely. And if you look at how the exemption regime has affected corporate taxes, which is available from the revenue foregone statement for the last 2 years, you'll see that the share of companies in the old tax revenue has declined, but the share of income being reported in the old tax revenue has not really declined. It has gone up marginally between last year and this year. And interestingly, the share of non-tax, the share of companies adopting the new tax regime is sort of very high in the highest income slab, which is positive. But it is not yet therefore clear who is it that we expect to go into the new regime. The other 2 or 3 interesting things that I thought were interesting in the budget is, one is a huge push for IT-based solutions. We see that in how the government proposes to facilitate activities in agriculture by setting up open source digital systems to provide information on what would have been called agricultural extension services. So that is one element. How many farmers will be able to use it, and whether we need another level of intervention to make these services accessible will be another question. Where I found it more interesting is in the skill development program, where the government seeks now build in a portal where the users of labor, that is the employers, will be able to ask for specific skill sets, which can then be incorporated into the training to generate the skill sets which are required. Because the earlier criticism for the skill development program was a mismatch between what the program was producing and what the country needed. So this can bring about a closer match, and that I think is very interesting. The third element, which is happening in a small way, but which can potentially have interesting ramifications, is this focus on R&D for specific identified sectors. In this budget, we are looking at R&D allocations for 5G and AI. We are looking at allocations for pharma and a couple of other sectors. I believe that the world increasingly recognizes that wealth is now created more through IP, intellectual property, and less through other dimensions. So it is useful for governments to give a push to R&D, and I think that is the other element that I sort of enjoyed seeing in the budget. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita. Thank you. Before we go to the next speaker, I just wanted to clarify 2 numbers from you. We'll come back for more questions later. Do you have the number, the share of levies and cesses? You mentioned that the share of states is only 30%. What is the share of levies and cess in the center's tax revenue? Is it more than 20% now?
I don't offhand, I haven't offhand got the number, but it can be easily pulled out. So I don't have it.
Second question was, I had this clarification is, you said that there's a statement on revenue foregone, which was a practice started about 10, 12 years ago. So is that number now bigger than the interest expense?
No, it is 75,000 crores for corporate India.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to Professor Pradeep Apte.
Budget is a very strange melange of Shakespeare plays, right from Midsummer Night Dream to Hamlet. You have all shades there because you are talking of both past, present challenges and future together. I'm going to talk about some things which probably are not in line with what we have been discussing so far. Firstly, I don't think this ratio to GDP makes sense. I have said this even before. It is better to have it straight away to what your revenue earning capacity has been, because that effectively signals how much saving you are tapping for meeting your revenue deficit, which is the primary concern. Capex is something which anyway is, government happens to be a borrower to whom the banks cannot deny and RBI cannot deny. So anyway, that will somehow be funded. So it is better to in fact look at this, and there is a reason why I'm reiterating this. There are many signals in terms of pronouncements and the
even advertisement like pronouncements that have been made, which are significant to in fact doubt our GDP numbers. The kind of resilience that we have shown, both in terms of tempering the nature of inflationary pressure experienced elsewhere as against ours, in spite of rise in some of the petroleum products later when they were slashed initially and then raised again. I think this GDP business is lacking something. It is missing something very significant, as a result of which you get the numbers which probably would be even more optimistic if the missed GDP is included in this. Secondly, like I'll just give you one example. The number of crop cutting experiments that were reported to have been conducted for the purposes of agricultural insurance, if they are incorporated in agricultural value added, I'm pretty sure that our agricultural value added figures will get revised. Secondly, there is also a claim which says nearly 2 lakh crores were distributed among 11 crore farmers every year, which effectively amounts to 1,500 rupees per month per farmer, which is being transmitted. Even believing that there is like our pharmaceutical approval cutoff rate of 50%, even 50% is true, this is a significant amount. And that probably, again, does not get necessarily reflected in our mechanism, established mechanism of estimation of consumption expenditure. By and large, this is also a problem of what is the often called as unregistered sector activity across all sectors in CSO parlance. So I think for institutions like Gokhale Institute, these are the kind of points and the reflections which are or data that are showed in the budget. Like, for example, 48 crores Jan Dhan accounts. What is happening to that? It's something which is a worthwhile activity to look at, because in the pandemic period, every alternate month, if it was a Jan Dhan account held by a woman, then it used to be credited for 500 rupees. So please also pay attention to the GDP number that we so fondly use in taking it as a ratio to whatever government does. The numbers of the expenditure and receipts are more realistic than the GDP numbers. So unless we are comparing with someone else, maybe across nations or sometimes across states, taking a ratio to GDP by itself does not serve purpose, because everyone knows that the entire GDP does not get covered under the tax net. So this is as far as the usual ritual statistic of the budget is concerned. There are a number of other things. The most worrying thing for the last decade or so has been stagnation in private investment. We have to really explore, has it something to do with the nature of borrowing program which the government has? Because with government borrowing at a almost pre-negotiated fixed rate, and banks having a comfortable interest income position on their balance sheet to earn that, probably does not provide enough push or incentive for the banks to look for which investment they should be funding from, coming from private sector. This is another way of looking at what we otherwise call as crowding out effect, because the government borrows heavily and the banks are comfortable with what government borrowings are providing, then probably their drive for searching for better customer to have loans is likely to be subdued. Keep aside all these factors. Let us look at one sector which Kavita referred to. One is education. Because there are a number of schemes, like every year, the new schemes or the old schemes revised and decorated differently are often presented in the budget. There are two striking things. One is there is a talk about AI getting a push on the one hand. And secondly, there is also talk about restructuring the erstwhile scheme that was declared as a skill development scheme, Skilling India program. Obviously, it was not so well conceptualized program, nearly 10,000 crores allocated for that, but the institutional agencies that were available at the disposal of the government, and please note, it is not only union government, but also state governments. There are ITIs were in fact one of the backbone of this entire program, and one knows what kind of a dilapidated state the ITIs have. Therefore, they were the most inappropriate institutions to run this kind of a program. Thankfully, government now admits that, and it says that probably there is a mismatch of skills, then what is demanded, what is supplied, those who are going to be potential employers should give a feedback. I think government should also consider the possibility of using some other institutional arrangement that are available with both state government as well as the union government, namely educational institutions, particularly those which are serving education or giving education after 10th standard onwards, and blend them with a program, something like NCC camps do, because the even an NCC-like structure is capable of imparting many skills. In fact, we had given one program of this type with the leadership of the NCC commander here, because in the NCC commanding, we don't have to necessarily have Agnipats, Agniveers. We can also have Shilpaveers, and they could be trained for this purpose either. And NCC, paradoxically may it sound, is a right institution capable of giving this kind of a skill development and the training. So together with colleges, junior colleges onwards, if this program is blended, the possibility of Skilling India scheme and the spending are likely to be more productive. In general, we should be aware that this is also to do with whether the spending was adequate or not, or whether it has been reallocated. Reallocation is something which is presumed in the budget. Earlier, it used to happen more complex way, but in some cases more comfortable way, because we have a plan and non-plan kind of a distinction. Now, there are many departments who anyway don't spend what is allocated to them during the year. So there is enough room for the reallocation, as a result of which, whatever that looks like, in fact, obfuscation in the accounting is within the legitimate limits of the government, and that is something which is very easy to happen. I don't remember whether budget says so or economic survey says so. It in fact gives unspent amounts that were budgeted and allocated, but they were not actually spent. So this is something that we have to actually look at when we look at the budget. Now I come to a sector which is, strictly speaking, is often not perceived as the union government sector, namely agriculture, which is not so, because union government has a huge presence in agriculture, particularly in form of what we call the administration of minimum support price mechanism under the mechanism of the FCI procurement. Simultaneously, the both survey as well as the budget talks about another program, which is in fact the millet program, which I think is a very welcome recognition. But there are two reforms which are needed if any such kind of a thing was to be achieved. Firstly, Food Corporation of India, if you look at its entire procurement mechanism for several decades now, it is heavily concentrated in favor of only 3 states. Consequently, all other remaining states remain deprived of possibility of having either an infrastructure or the benefit whatsoever that they emerge from the MSP-like scheme. If you consider this in the context of millet program, in fact, good part of the millet program, it is probably impossible to implement across India. And it is also not likely to be perhaps possible in context of specific crops, because they are grown only in certain small regions, even of a state, forget about nation. If this millet program also starts getting a component, so first thing, I think 3 things that are needed in this case, because that something concerns the subsidy component of the food expenditure, which union government budget has, running the so-called PDS and the FCI operations. Firstly, it is better to declare what we call in WTO parlance blue box subsidy for Punjab and Haryana. Give subsidy for not cultivating certain crops, which also has huge amount of environmental implication. Secondly, redirect the procurement you otherwise make from these 3 most favored kind of states when it comes to procurement to other states, so that the other states start looking at how to reorganize their agriculture procurement, and more or less now abundant kind of structures that exist in state warehousing corporation, Maharashtra included. If this is done, then probably there is going to be another better step towards using forward markets with government and state government presence, so that they are being very arbitrarily banned all of a sudden by SEBI. That need not take place, because that requires a stabilizing agency which would be able to in fact generate a stable component when it comes to trade in food grains. If it to be streamlined, instead of looking at forward markets as a speculative game, it is better that the government start leveraging it for its own purposes, so that they procure it at a low cost and also manage it in a manner so that the prices don't fall beyond the limit. So I'm saying this because the 3 major reforms that were supposed to be floated but had to be taken back, many people are in fact to be blamed for this, including Supreme Court. But if now agriculture sector needs to be reformed, it needs to reform in these matters first, where the union government has a huge presence. 2, it is not to be treated as a state subject, because trade in agricultural commodity is not confined to any state. It is essentially interstate, and therefore the union government must do some scheme. ENAM, which was floated in 2015-16, has not made much progress, which needs to be in fact rethought and revived on a different platform, like for example, inclusion of millets. there is even more important thing. On the one hand, we are talking of all kinds of IT technology being infused. One major element that is still within the domain of the union government is use of genetic engineering based kinds of crops. And now it is almost 15 years that GEAC proposal on at least 3 major crops where the so-called genetical modification has been embodied, and it is only based on only one single gene, that is the Bacillus thuringiensis gene. But it is not yet approved even now. This was proposed in 2009, and this is 2023. And we talk of change in technology, where agriculturists cannot have an option of experiment with any other technology except the traditional crop breeding. I think this is the most retrograde step, and I get even more worried when there is a loose talk about what is called natural farming and boost to the natural farming. This is the most unfounded kind of a path that we are actually choosing, because the data are scattered, experiments are scattered. There has not been a single scheme where something like even organic versus non-organic crop controlled experiments that are being conducted across the states. So in fact, to believe that now we are going to go to nature and promote natural farming is all mythology. And it is playing with the incomes of the farmers. It is better that we do it in a sensible manner rather than in doing it in such a fanciful manner. Declaring your farming to be natural farming, way back in 2000, we had in fact the so-called manual which stated, when do you call your output to be organic? Show me a state which has got even an officer who looks after how to certify an organic crop. So please be aware, this whole talk of natural farming on the one hand, and a very deep silence, deafening silence about not approving GEAC. We approve even life-saving drugs in 4 years. And we can't approve GEAC modification, small modification to a genetical structure of a given crops. It's something which is unbelievable. And we at the same time talk about the scientific temper to be promoted. So I am hopeful about AI because the community which is likely to be involved in this is more active. It is technologically more oriented. But again, let us hope that they don't have to again go to some ministry to get the approval. This is something which is a promising area. As it has happened in case of drone, the extent of drone users that must have exploded in India have not exploded as much. I'm worried that it might happen in case of AI as well. So AI is one of the important area to be selected for the government support, but let it be institutional support in the sense of having more predictable kinds of pathways rather than government approval route. If that happens, then God saves us. So these are some of the comments. There is one more comment which I wanted to make. I forgot that. When we talked about the stagnant private investment, almost 2011 onwards, or nearly now 12 years, government is probably pretty aware of the uncertainty that affects flows, capital flows across borders. And one hint of that is, there is a mention of, after a long time, probably when Ashok Lahiri wrote a report in 2001, 2002, when Yashwant Sinha was finance minister, the P-notes, which is our peculiar innovation to get our own capital back to India to be invested, is now said to be approved subject to the so-called Indian fiscal code requirements, which is a signaling of the fact that probably this stream is something which the government wants to in fact leverage and also keep it open. So that is as far as the private investment is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. For those of you who did not get that last reference, we are 62 minutes into the session, and first time the word was mentioned without mentioning. He was referring to the Adani company case. But I want to ask a question before we go to Professor Subhashish. One question to you. And by the way, when he said about millets, it is very true. He said we should give subsidy to Punjab farmers for not growing. In 1950, in Punjab, 11 lakh hectares were under millets. 11 lakh hectares. Today, it is 1,000 hectares. Thanks to MSP on rice and wheat. And I want a quick answer from you. You said that, by the way, he very successfully ended up chastising the economists who talked about ratios and so on. And he also chastised the other camp which talks about organic growth and whatever. The question to you is, you mentioned that these lot of these amounts which are allocated are not spent. And in fact, this is a trend for many, many years. Then what is the sanctity of budgeting? What is the importance of budget then?
The only sanctity is Constitution requires that not a penny to be spent unless it is approved. It doesn't say that you must spend.
More importantly, it's very difficult to spend by a bureaucrat.
No, just so that the students don't think this is an annual ritual, haldi kumku nahi hai. There is much more importance and seriousness to budgeting. But Professor Apte said, year after year, we budget something and the actual performance is in far divergence. But I think the discipline of measuring the divergences and the deviations has gotten better and better. But his larger point is well taken. Professor Subhash, over to you. I can't resist now. Look at him very carefully. Does he remind you? Famous movie which has been doing, the rounds last couple of weeks. Anyway, over to you, Professor Subhash.
No, thank you, Ajit. The first time this budget session was held, there was standing room only. In the 8th version or 8th edition, there are a lot of empty spaces. Now, that is a very good sign for me. It's not unspent amount, it's the growing realization that the union budget is an irrelevant document. So I say it is irrelevant because of the various things that has already been said about being budgeted for but not being spent. But also, if you look at the speech was a really short speech. But what was even more surprising and pleasantly so is the division between the part A and the part B. Part A was about an hour, part B was about 10 or 15 minutes. But part B is really the budget, right? So clearly, even the central government is aware that the budget is slowly becoming irrelevant. In part A, there was a lot more talk about achievements before the budget, right? What has happened throughout the year, than what is going to happen in the next year, next financial year, other than the fact that the taxes were reduced. So if people were getting bored of the achievements, that was, sort of sneaked in. Part B of the budget, GST aa gaya, so there's nothing much to do in indirect taxes. Direct taxes have already been said in part A, but part B had to be there, so there was some tinkering with customs duties as usual. So, if I look at the entire budget, therefore, it is clearly not the important thing that we are looking for various reasons. One is, of course, that what we need now is a restructuring of the economy, and there is very little the central government can do on that. Much of the restructuring has to come at the state level. When we talk about, for example, health and education, however much we may hope that the central government can do something, it cannot, unless the states gear up. And this is something that we must be talking about every year when the budget comes out. And I know this because, our institution is also part of the so-called 5-institution budget discussion, which happens in Delhi. And IDF is in charge of the social sector, right? So I blame myself also for that we talk about health and education, which obviously are things in the social sector, based on the central budget. And that's really a waste of time and irresponsibility on the part of the intellectual or the economist, because we have to go down to the states with this problem. Health and education, it has to be the states which take up a lot. Of course, the central government can provide money and resources, but where is the state plan? If we look at the state budgets, for example, right? We can start talking about health and education, which we don't. Okay, so having said that, the next point I want to make is that this was indeed an election year budget. Right, so that was obvious. Why? Because it was clearly directed at the people, and it was not directed at business, labor, agriculture, this community, that community, right? It was people. And why do I say people? Rich, taxes reduced. Middle, taxes reduced. Poor, commitment to increase incomes. Okay, because they're not taxpayers in any case. Right? So those three were very clear. And if you start reading the budget with this lens, you will see that all these three have been touched in the budget. What was interesting is that in this budget, I did a word search in the budget speech. I did a word search for the word poor. The word poor. If you look at our earlier budgets, they're all over the place because in the name of the poor, we were doing everything. In this budget, poor was mentioned only once. And that too, when talking about poor prisoners who could not furnish bail and were hence kept back in prison, or could not pay the meager penalty that was imposed on them and hence were in jail. Other than that, there was no mention of the word poor. So this was an election year budget. The second reason why it was an election year budget is because it spread cheer all around. Right? Everything was hunky-dory, the achievements were talked about. New businesses, right? And digitalization. That was the focus. There is a hope in the government that our startup activities is going to generate new income, new jobs. And hence the focus on digitization, hoping that digitalization will follow. And wherever the private sector is unwilling to move in, the government will do so. And hence the talk of digital public infrastructure. Not using that term maybe, but all the health stack, the data stacks that the government is building is essentially to encourage startup businesses. Now, the best, and this example is given all the time, which is UPI. But I would want you to look a little bit closely at the data. In the UPI, unfortunately, more than 80% of all transactions is through Google Pay and PhonePe, both of which are foreign companies. Right? They are not domestic companies. So how much the new startup activity in India, domestic startups in India will take, will capitalize on these platforms is not quite clear. But on the other hand, this talk which was mentioned, and I forget by whom, by one of the panelists, about the fact that, I think it was Partha who mentioned this, yeah, that there is this feeling that much of these startups are being acquired by foreigners. And, you know, there is a sentiment that is growing in the country because of that. But let me be quite clear. What are these startups with money coming in from abroad? Most of these startups really need very little capital. What they need is working capital to be able to pay for the people who are working in there. And this is about 4 or 5 years before they give it up. Or, you know, it go through an IPO or is being acquired. It's a win-win situation for us. Why? Because for these 4 or 5 years, we are getting working capital, which doesn't have to be repaid. And it's capital coming in from outside. So I don't think we should get to nationalistic and start creating exit barriers. You know, whether essentially whether it is being acquired by a foreign company or the IPO is happening in a foreign stock market. Because these are some of the things that are being discussed. And I think over here, good economics trumps nationalism. So we have to be careful about that. There was talk about agriculture, 5G, millet. I'm not going to go into that. job creation. The one point I would like to make here is that there is a lot of talk about skilling the youth. And for some strange reason, and this is, I'm sorry to say this, this shows our elitism in our society. For some strange reason, we have decided that education and skill are two different arms, often orthogonal to each other. So you can talk about education without talking about skill, and you can talk on skill without talking about education. Now, the fact of the matter is, however poor the data are, if I were to look carefully at the data, people who have had an education, that is, whether they're secondary pass or graduate and above, as opposed to those who are not but skilled, the average wage of the educated are much higher than those who are skilled. This is what the data say. So, and that's why I say we are very elitist. You know, a mention was made of the NSDC and the 10,000 crore and all of that that Pradeep mentioned, right? But think about it. What were we thinking when we were doing that? And Pradeep is right. We never thought about it at all. We thought throwing money would be enough. They were 3-month, 6-month training programs. Let's be serious. We want a highly trained human capital workforce. 3-month, 6-month training. So, you know, so if we are talking about skilling the youth, we have to become a little bit more serious and treat it with as much prestige as we treat getting an IIT degree. So I'm not very happy with the skilling discussion that is going on in India. I wanted to make that point. In the budget too, there is talk about skilling, but there is no thought on this essential part. Why would a 15, 16-year-old decide to get skilled when you are telling that person over and over again, bhai, tumse kuch nahi hoga, tum yahan karo, yahan jao. That is our attitude when we talk about skill, even today. And unless we change that and bring skill into education, it's not going to work.
I have one question for you before we open up. You rightly said that about the skills and all is a much bigger debate. Not a debate, but we agree. But the question, quick question to you is that Partha Ray also said that there was some concern that the government thinks all these startups are happening and very quickly they go to a foreign ownership, flipping. But are you not worried, Subhashish, that even companies like Ola, which is well established now, and Flipkart, they're choosing to relocate to Singapore. They've gone out of India. That's something. I mean, at a time when everybody in the world is becoming more nationalistic and industrial policy focused on domestic national interests, even in the US is now putting subsidies for semiconductors. Should we not be worried that our own champions like Ola and Flipkart are moving out of India?
You know, the answer is no, I'm not worried. But the best way to make the argument is to give an example. But so please don't tell me, but they're a small country, we are different and all of that. Okay. Look at Israel. It has the largest high-tech skilled personnel comparable to the US with a much smaller population. None of those people who work in these high-tech industries in Israel keep their jobs in any one place for more than 4 or 5 years. But they're always employed. Because newer and newer startups come up. Because these are highly trained people. Because they have high productivity. And therefore a new startup picks them up. And imagine the amount of capital that is flowing in. And you're supporting labor and giving incomes to people who may or may not produce anything. Our businesses are focused on productivity. That's our problem. We don't take risks. Our only hope of taking risks is to start up. Why do we want to close that down? Our companies don't take risks. Let's be clear on that.
So we are going to go with questions now from directly from the audience. Vishal, do we have
Yes.
roaming? I'll
Yeah.
just take it. I'll be
Yeah.
moderating from here.
Yeah.
But roaming
Yeah.
mic for
So already
So
there.
there are roaming mics in the audience, and I'll keep this mic for the panelists.
I'll request the questioners to be very brief and precise, if possible, identify the panelists. Before we start the question, I forgot to mention one more important thing about GM. Professor Pradeep Apte reminded us that it's been 14 or 15 years since that GM approval has been pending. And we accept, actually, I think you are referring to GM Brinjal. GM Cotton, but GM Cotton is still illegal. I think. GM Cotton is still illegal. So, but de facto, I'm sure we are wearing clothes with GM Cotton. The funny thing is that GM stuff is allowed for our cattle or poultry. So we eat indirectly. Cattle, we don't eat. Oh, sorry, we don't eat cattle. Okay. But more importantly, today's newspaper mentions the Nobel Prize winner Venki Ramakrishnan, who has come out very strongly in supporting this GM food. So, in fact, it has been a movement among many scientists, but even the Nobel Prize winner is on record now. So that's an interesting thing. But all this seems to go outside the budget. So let's come back to the questions. Yeah. So we can start. Maybe I'll start with the one at the last row. Please speak loudly into the mic. No, we can't hear you because your mic is not working. Don't adjust the switch, just start speaking into the mic. Yeah, I'll repeat your question for the panelists. Please go ahead with your question. Can you just walk up from, because this cordless, yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is about this regime, and if investor who is driven by the ATC and the NPS driven investments, which are specified securities, specified instruments of the government.
Okay, so I think the question is about this is apparently a big mystery about the new income tax regime. So we will club 2 or 3 questions together, but I will ask Professor Kavita Rao to be ready with the answer, because I don't know if any of the other panelists would be competent or would feel confident. Next question. Yeah, please go ahead. Please give the mic here up front. Ek pude theva, ek mage theva. So please come.
Good afternoon, friends. So my question is to Dr. Gangopadhyay and to Mr. Apte. In your speech, you did mention about the skilling, and you both referred that the present system of ITIs is not working properly, and the educational institutions are also to be brought into the picture, whereby these programs can be better implemented. Dr. Gangopadhyay, while concluding your speech, you did say that the present system of skilling is not a perfect system. My query to you and to you and Dr. Dr. Ajit Ranade is, can we form a format and can you prepare a report how this could be done, how we can bring all these things together?
Okay.
See, we understand that at present there are a lot of lacunas in this.
Yeah.
There are shortcomings, but only saying that shortcomings are there will not help. Now, really, we want the answer from the you economists that how this can be done.
Okay. Fair
Thank
point.
you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take 2 more questions and then we can. Yeah, the gentleman in pink. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Neil Borade. I'm a journalist with Mint, livemint.com. So my question is to do with the TCS, the tax collected at source, that's been imposed on remittances, except for those for education and health. So our job in personal finance is to look at the budget from the micro point of view, from the individual's point of view. And the implication of this TCS, because there is no threshold limit, there was earlier a 7 lakh threshold limit, that's gone. So the implication is that even if you go like whatever holiday you take, the cost goes up by 20%. So your thoughts on this TCS?
Okay, well, one more question and then we'll come to you later. Yeah, so green shirt. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. I'm Sridhar from Pune International Center, from Bajaj Auto, and I have a question for Dr. Subhashji. You had mentioned that, of course, you had done the word counts, then that the word poor was mentioned only once, but in the context of poor pensioners. And then you concluded that
Poor prisoners, not pensioners.
Sorry, poor,
sometimes pensioners feel like prisoners.
Poor, and then you had reached the conclusion that it was therefore an election budget. But actually, it should have been the other way around, because poor is not mentioned, it is not an election budget.
Okay,
And,
so we have
sorry,
we have
limit. Comment, but the main point was whether India is poised to become the third largest economy in the world in the next 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Japan and Germany.
yeah, so we had 4 questions. One starting with the new income tax, then we have skilling, we have TCS and poor. So Dr. Kavita Rao, would you like to take the first question on the new, very briefly, the mystery of the new income tax proposal?
I'm happy to take the question, but I didn't hear the question. I couldn't hear it. So
I think broadly the question is that there is some confusion about the new income tax scheme, whether it really is reducing income tax liability, especially in terms of for the slightly higher middle class incomes, right, Sudhanva? And from an investor's point of view, people are putting money in NPS and other investment vehicles. So, but very briefly, if you can tell us about the new income tax scheme, there is a charge against it that this is just hocus pocus and it is really not reducing income tax. Can you just give us a simple interpretation?
Yeah, so the simple interpretation is that by raising the slabs and the thresholds, we have delivered some benefits to the consumer, to the taxpayer. The sales pitch is that for people now can pay lower tax without having to save, and that seems to be the thing that attracts the taxpayer. Because earlier you had to do ATC savings or to do insurance of various kinds in order to avail the benefits. Now you can get that lower rate without having to do those savings. As far as NPS is concerned, it has not been excluded from. It has been excluded from the coverage of the new scheme. So contributions to NPS continue to give you benefits, but contributions to PF, all the ATC Chapter 6 have been eliminated. So I hope that clarifies.
Okay, but I would recommend this is more like a question for a chartered accountant, and this is an economist panel. Yeah, Dr. Kavita, the related question is, what will be the impact on the savings rate because of this tax reduction? Is there any impact on the aggregate savings rate of the economy?
Yeah. The wisdom of the economists has been that the form of savings changes when you have incentives. People choose to move from one instrument to the other, not necessarily to increase the amount of savings. So therefore, one doesn't expect dramatic change in the level of savings. One would expect to see a change in what instruments the savings are put into. And if the governments are not too worried about having access to savings of the households through these tax incentives, then it's a good move.
Yeah, it will reduce the burden of interest in the future for the government. So it actually is a good thing for the government. Incidentally, on ATCC, I believe the revenues foregone are very high, right? It's almost 1 lakh crores. That exemption, I read some number, it's a very high number. The government loses revenues because of the ATC exemption.
But but by reducing the rates, you want to deliver this similar kinds of benefits.
Exactly. Yeah.
The trade-off is sitting right there.
Right.
And the government choosing to pay higher rates of interest is not mitigated by removing the exemption alone, because we are trying to sell the idea that small saving schemes are being made attractive for small savers, and that continues. So that
That's, by the
element.
way, yes. That's for the audience. That's just to note that there was a disagreement between the panelists. But anyway, the second question was on skilling. Professor Apte or Subhashish, any one of you, or he said, you guys only tell us what the problem is. Tell us a solution. Skilling ko kaisa karenge? Kare to kaisa kare? Please speak it in the mic. Yeah.
You're asking a question personally. I will answer it personally. But before that, I'll give you some idea of what I meant by that. See, the very large number of educational institutions or institutions which have a capacity to give some kind of a skill training are not usually within the union government fold. They are usually within the local government or with the state government. If you are from Pune, I can tell you, on Ghole Road, there is Mama Rao Date Center, where in fact junior college students used to opt for electronic courses, and many of the colleges at that time did not have even a lab for electronics. The school on Apte Road. So, see, skilling is something which can be earned informally by looking at, by reading on our own, by learning on your own. But it can also be given part of the blend of something that can be called a classroom teaching plus something like a hands-on experience. Skilling program per se does not say that it must be necessarily with the educational institution. That's the reason why ITI, like a setup, was thought that they would be able to deliver that so-called hands-on experience kind of thing more easily. But it is mostly an outdated and even dilapidated status, because even many of them do not have adequate staff to train them. Secondly, there are skilling of various sorts, and that kind of a diversity cannot be always handled only by formal educational institutions. Some of them have to be, in fact, only learning by doing with someone else who is doing it. And that's the way in which large number of skills are actually acquired. So to believe that every kind of a skilling can be undertaken by the government itself is a mirage. There are certain kinds of skills for which there is obvious demand. There is possibility of doing a kind of a micro world to be created where conceptually, as well as in terms of handling of it in real terms, person becomes little more comfortable and therefore little more capable, so that he could be easily hired. There are, one can go on to like this. There are many my friends who run the company tell me that the B engineers don't know how to handle simple equipment. So that is something which is a gap in educational institutions as well. And if you hope educational institution to address all these gaps, perhaps again we are doing the same ITI kind of a mistake. Better option would be educational institutions come together, form a pool, and jointly use certain kinds of skilling or training facilities of the type which are not confined to very narrow definition. Now let me answer personally. I was earlier working in a college. We had a very large electronics department till MSc. But if you ask our BSc or MSc student to install a solar panel in our own college campus, they had an inability to do that. This is something which could have been easily done in 3 years of BSc electronics training. It doesn't require a huge amount of additional setup. It is a mindset of what is to be taught, what kinds of a skill can be simultaneously transmitted. That is something which is a lookout for the educational institution, and the state governments must have a flexibility in doing that. Conceptually, NEP does it. In terms of financial, in terms of other resource allocations and compulsions of the educational institution, how it could be accommodated remains an unanswered question. Unfortunately, Dr. Mashelkar is not here. He is in fact heading the committee of Maharashtra government to look into these kinds of matters.
I completely agree with what Pradeep just said. I'll just add one more thing. In India, unfortunately, higher education essentially trains you to be more and more elitist, right? You move further and further away from where you started. And that is because we give too much respect or significance to knowledge. वो बहुत कुछ जानते हैं. Right? That's our standard description. Right? Public intellectualism is the most important thing in India. You can talk on anything, right? So if we move away from that and train our students to become problem solvers, problems around them, we start building educational institutions in huge campuses away from the city, put the faculty and the students together for 4 or 5 years, completely disconnected with life around them. And then we expect them to solve society's problems. The education system, the way we plan it, has to change. People have to be connected to where they're studying. IIT Kharagpur was built so that, it was one of the first IIT, the first IIT, right? It was built so that the area around it could develop. What goes on in IIT Kharagpur, people outside don't know. What is happening outside, people inside IIT Kharagpur don't know. Right? I met a professor long ago in the mid-80s. He was a mathematician, a Fields medalist. So he had come to visit ISI, where I was, Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi Center. So then he had come to visit, we became very close friends. So he was, maybe I should not give the name. He had just gone back from one of the, top institutions, not only in India, but in the world, right? Mathematical institutions. So he went back and he said, it's a beautiful place, I will not describe it anymore. You'll figure out which place it is. But he said, the problem was, why is it like this in your country? The problem is that they had no idea what is happening outside the gates of the institution. So that's what I mean by, training people. That's what the education system does, to be problem solvers. Which problems? Society's problems, the society they're coming from. The oldest, one of the oldest surviving institutions in the world, in its charter, it says the following thing, University of Lund in Sweden. It says, in its very first paragraph, the objective of the institution is to train the Danes, that is to say people from Denmark, train the Danes how to behave like the Swedes. If you look at Oxford University, all our governors general came from that university, right? So that is what you have to do. You have to train people to solve your society's problems. And that we are not doing. How many engineers, Pradeep just mentioned, how many engineers in India, in the IIT, spend time in a lab? They don't.
Professor Apte wants to add a rebut, but I hope Gokhale Institute students know what's happening outside the gate.
Quickly. I refer to the scheme which we had proposed, where the NCC come NSS blend program could be used in the colleges, not necessarily in the colleges, in the schools. That was because when you train for army, there are a number of skills which require all kinds of odd physical works. So if the village panchayat is to plan for its own local infrastructure, the kinds of things that you need to understand in planning, conceptualizing, can be taught by these training alone, and that training is usually adequate. In fact, if you look at the way Britishers used to manage for it, when there were no roads, when there were no bridges, how did they manage? They managed it with a similar kind of a thing, use the local labor and use it with their own imagination. And they could, in fact, build bridges which were temporary bridges, even in the times of high floods. So whether it is some national disaster or whatever kind of thing, a small level, village level infrastructure, how it is to be conceptualized. If you ask that person who has just migrated from a BSc college at a taluka place, he doesn't have an answer for it. That's the kind of a skill which is anyway needed. And if you ask now a Gram Panchayat, Gram Sevak to conceptualize all this and send a planning estimate, and the funds come and he is supposed to spend it, I think there are all kinds of mismatch of skills which is occurring with us.
The good news is that Gokhale Institute is introducing as a compulsory course this aspect of experiential learning for all students. So the existing batches take note. Secondly, the new education policy actually takes cognizance, so to answer your question, of the importance of experiential learning and the complementarity between skills and education. Also, not to forget that we actually have a National Apprentice Act. Most of the learning actually happens, the skill building happens on the job. But I think I'll request panelists, including myself, to be brief about the answers. We have Okay, this is a big topic.
You use the term experiential learning. Experiential learning is not learning from experience, please. Experiential learning is application of theory to real life.
Yeah, immersive. Yeah.
So you have to turn it around. That's how you integrate skilling with it.
Learning by doing. So very quickly, if you could answer those other two questions. One was a question by Neil about the TCS. Partha Ray, would you like the tax collected at source? Kavita Rao, would you have an answer to that? You know, the outbound remittances, you know, India receives the highest remittances in the world, $100 billion this year. And for the last 23 out of last 27 years, India has been number one ahead of China. But what people don't realize is in the last 4 years, the outbound remittances going for foreign education, people are going after 12th standard now. And tourism has been going up exponentially. So this year, that number is $22 billion. Now the government is so panicky. So now every time you make an outbound remittance, they collect, that's called TCS, not to be confused with the famous software company. So his question was about TCS. Kavita Rao, you have a quick answer for that?
Yeah, so the TCS is akin to TDS. TDS is on incomes paid. TCS is on transactions of demand and supply, and it is set off against your income tax. So it is supposed to be an advance tax that government is collecting to ensure you file and report appropriate incomes. So that is the purpose. So
it's now 20%.
If you are reporting, yeah. This is to force people to pay the tax and file the return, because there are a number of instances in even the lower end of the channel where of tax paying, where people are happy to pay a small amount of TDS or TCS and not want to file a return. So this is to coax and coerce better compliance.
Okay, quickly on this poor, mention of the word poor. He said, in fact, not mentioning poor means was a good thing.
Seriously, after demonetization, you still think that the poor vote because of that? When let's be real, and the poverty is coming down, so that's not the largest constituency anymore.
So one more last round of questions. I'll take 3 or 4, and then yes, please give him the mic. Please. Yeah.
The question on the third largest economy, India becoming. So I have seen at least one set of numbers, the latest IMF forecast. They have indeed forecasted that by 28-29, India is going to surpass both Germany and Japan and going to be the third largest economy. 1. 2, please do remember these are nominal number. So there are 3 ways you can grow. One is higher inflation prices, higher productivity, or an appreciated rupee. Either of the 3 ways you can grow. And the third thing is, if you take per capita income, by the time India is becoming the third largest economy, I've checked the ranking. India's ranking in the world in the per capita ladder is something in the range of 140.
140, that's right. So India will be ranked out of 190 countries 141st or something. But you know, please, the person sitting next to him, Professor Pradeep Apte, already said he is not concerned about GDP at all. So please forget about GDP. So we'll take just 3 or 4 questions because we're running out of time. We really need to wrap up now. So maybe we'll start with Onkar and that gentleman at the back and that lady. The 3 questions, right? So okay, Abhay also. So we just quickly brief questions.
Sir, this is a question on the skilling issue. Professor Apte, you would be aware of this Pabal Vigyan Ashram in Pune district, where Professor Kalbag, Dr. Kalbag, trained rural dropout students to do in technical training for rural problems. So repairing of pump sets and small electrical repairs, etc.
Question, please, question.
Yeah, so the question is, what do you think of this model?
Okay. Onkar, please ask a question. Yeah.
Right. So mine is focused on the pensions, especially the government pensions, with OPS being in the news. And of course, there has also been a pension-related change in the last few years, which is OROP. So does OROP offer any lessons for,
So
what
your
states are
question
trying
is the old pension scheme better than the new pension
No, no,
scheme?
no. So OPS, I think there has already been.
That's a rhetorical question because
No,
everybody
so
knows.
OROP, the effects of OROP are being felt in terms of the disability.
What's the question?
Does OROP offer any insights for us when it comes to the OPS, right? So how scared should we be?
Okay. That in the blue, yeah, the lady in the blue, yeah.
Panelists. I'm Ishwar Arora, student of GIP only. My question is to Dr. Pradeep Apte, sir. You mentioned that there are many departments which do not spend the amount that has been allocated to them. So I just have two questions. One, why is this so? And two, can you please name a few of these departments?
Largest and consistent in this has been Department of Defense. And there are several reasons for this. It's not necessarily an inefficiency alone. There are, if at all there are inefficiencies, there are actually procedural matters. Like for example, I propose a deal to have for some purchase, and that purchase for the approval at all stages from all corners may take even 3, 4, 5 years. And as a result of which, even if the allocation has been made, it would remain unspent. There could be also several reasons for this. Like for example, you don't have a capacity of all sorts. For example, MNRGS kind of a scheme, EGS scheme. It was always available, but not many districts often opted for it because they didn't have capacity to spend.
We also had more than 10 or 11 chairmen of nationalized banks and major PSU corporations going without chairman because they were not appointed. So these are bureaucratic procedures and there are bottlenecks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
So when I said the capacity to spend, look, I'll give you an example of EGS because I was a part of it at the time. EGS was in fact brainchild of mostly VM Dandekar and not US Page, as this is often called. It is part of his Power in India book. We used to conduct in his institute, Indian School of Political Economy, workshop for deputy collectors who were in charge of looking at the desk where all the works which are labor-intensive works would be compiled. How to organize that and how to ensure that I start a work, for 2 days there is an attendance and for next 6 days there is no attendance. How to tackle this kind of problem is a problem for the local to deputy collector staff. And therefore, even if they will to, they have a will to spend it, there would be several kind of difficulties which makes them unspent.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Last question, please.
Good afternoon to one honored present here. The government has raised its capital expenditure from 3.9% to 4.6% that it's mentioned. And if gross fixed capital formation, as it says, still stands to be lower today. My question is why private investment is not picking up despite corporate tax reductions and schemes like public incentives.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we'll do is answer the questions and have wrap-up comments from each of the panelists to wrap up the our panel discussion today. So just to remind you, one question was about the Pabal rural development. Second was about OROP, any lessons from that? And this is about why private sector investment is stagnating. I'll request all the panelists to actually also combine it with their closing statement. So maybe we can start with you, Professor Pradeep Apte.
Okay. First about Kalbagh Center in Pabal. I was myself associated with it. In fact, we did a small project. We have dried figs from Purandar, which is a very large amount. And in fact, we had interaction with that center, how to produce dry figs so that they can compete with the dry figs that we get from Afghanistan and Iraq. So I'm pretty well aware of that center. In fact, Janar, for which I happen to be a director, was also a partner institution there. I'm not against it. Of course, any such kind of a replication. Pabal is probably well recognized, well known because it was relatively rare phenomena in those times. I can show you many institutes in Pune which train people to become good electricians, good plumbers. Many a times, good plumbers and like Baput Services kind of agency also creates its own trainees, apprentices, and train plumbers. So skilling is a very big word and a very big world for that matter. And therefore, any such kind of an institution which appropriately comes up either suo moto or through government inducement or for educational institution is welcome. There's no problem about it.
We-
About the crowding out that was asked. See, the crowding out is a easy thing to talk in class. There is some amount of crowding in when the government expenditure goes up. What I was referring to as a private investment being stagnant is in fact more about the registered, organized, and that too in fact mostly corporate sector. Because there have been, as Subhash rightly mentioned, we often look for the solutions at the center and when the problems actually lie at the state level or at the local level. It is the politics at the local level, it is the nuisance at the local level or the irritation at the state level that often causes the private investment not to be so forthcoming because of the kind of things that they face.
I'll request Professor Kavita Rao to go next. If you would like to address some of the questions and also your own closing comments.
I think I'll just add a sentence to what has just been said by Professor Apte, that there is a question of corporate sector investing when there is adequate demand, and the story seems to be that we're looking at underutilized capacities, and therefore, if the private sector is choosing to wait until demand picks up, somebody has to make the demand pick up, and that is another way in which there is complementarity between public and private investment. So that is what I thought I'd like to add, and I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Partha Ray.
Just a quick comment and summing up in that sense. The crucial question is that private investment is not picking up. We do not have a good handle on that. First. Second, there are hypotheses about lack of demand. Professor Kaushik Basu mentions about something to do with business trust could be responsible. So I do not know the reality, but that's one question that is haunting us over the last 6 to 7 years. If I have the data, we do not have very recent private investment data, but at least the firm data doesn't say so. So end of the day, it's how much the government can do, how much the private sector has to be forthcoming. It's altogether a different question.
Yeah.
For example, what the project we are working in Kolhapur district, DIC, I went and asked for the investment number of these and we do not have the data. They predicted something like 10,000 units, but when I went to the MSCDCL distribution company, very enthusiastic executive engineer, I asked him, can you give me the live industry connections?
So
I got the 37,000 plus connections in Kolhapur district with 12,000 plus fixed connections.
So
employment, investment, cross value addition, cross value output,
will
good part of our GDP now missing.
anyway, we'll take it up offline because they'll be available after the session. So he's coming. He's from Kolhapur University, Shivaji University, and ground level data. So last comments from Professor Subhashish, including if you want to answer some of the questions and your wrap up comments.
I've now forgotten the questions, but I'll.
One was about crowding in. The other one was, well, bubble we answered. Then OROP, any lessons to be run from OROP?
I should not have asked what the questions were. I have nothing to say about OROP. As for, the thing is that if we go back to our own history, remember Mahalanobis of Indian Statistical Institute, right? So he was given a problem, the entire problem of sampling in a big country like ours, right? He solved it by himself, by going out. That was the problem that was given to him. If you have seen the movie Rocket Boys, you know that those are the problems that we solved. That was all part of the training that we got. These are real life, actual problems being solved by people who are highly trained. In India, that has stopped happening. So unless we connect that, what I say connecting with the neighborhood, right? And that's I'll be happy to speak with you offline because that's the curriculum that I've designed for my university. where everything that is being taught is connected to the neighborhood, right, in various ways. So that is one thing we need to do. In other words, what I'm saying is that skilling has to be treated as an integral part of the education system, not separate, because then it won't work. What we talk about vocation, that's very different. If I look at the vocational programs in most countries which have very good vocational training, it's not 6 months, 3 months, it's 3 years. And in those 3 years, the first 1 or 2 years is pure theory. Pure theory. This concept that you don't need to know theory, I don't know from where it has come to India. It's very unique. We are very unique in that. Key experiment or experience is sabam seekh lenge. So that as for the investment, well, India has never been very progressive with investment. Essentially, we're a country of traders, not of producers. As I keep saying, risk trading is not there. Sorry, risk taking is not there, right, in the older companies. And since 91, wherever there is a demand gap, we have moved in. Many of the things we count as innovation are essentially meeting demand gaps. They're business innovation. They're not technological innovations. Technological innovations are really being done by the small startups. It's not being done by big business, right? The very big businesses in IT also are not doing it.
So on that note, I think, I'm sorry, we are out of time and we are really over time as well. So I'll just spend 2 minutes in wrapping up and see this discussion is very open-ended. As you can see, we covered topics like AI and GM crops and skilling and so on, which go far beyond experiential learning, which go really much beyond the budget. But to come back to the budget, what happened is the next day, some of the headlines effect was diluted because another big event happened where there was a huge downfall in a company's stock price and a fully subscribed FPO had to be recalled. So that, some of it got overshadowed by that. It's a 40 lakh crore budget, which means for every man, woman and child in India, it's 1/3 of a lakh spending. So in your name, in our name, the finance minister is planning to spend 1/3 of a lakh, almost 33,000 rupees. So it's a big deal, even though, but unfortunately, half of the taxes are not in the budget because half the taxes collected are in GST, which is outside the ambit of the finance minister. The finance minister has nothing to say on that. It's now part of GST Council. So that's why, as the panelists also said, some of it has become kind of routine or uninteresting. And because this event is watched by millions and millions of people inside and outside India, this is used as an opportunity to make a political statement. So therefore, you had this budget speech in terms of a list of achievements. So we didn't actually see a lot of discussion or speech in terms of the actual nitty-gritties because perhaps, as we are seeing, they are becoming a large part of it is non-discretionary. For example, interest payments, something like 10 to 12 lakh crores, 10 to 12 trillion rupees. There's no choice. You have to spend it. And that's increasing. India is, by the way, an outlier among all the major nations, especially emerging market economies. The amount of money we spend on interest on debt alone is almost 3 times the average of all emerging market countries. We spend 42 or 45% of our tax revenues. So that is why economists talk about fiscal concerns all the time. But because we have a young demography, so in terms of today's deficit is tomorrow's taxes. If I have a deficit today, I have to borrow money, therefore I have to repay it tomorrow, so I have to have taxes tomorrow. So tomorrow's generation, because there are more people being born, the per capita load of tax burden for tomorrow's generation is relatively manageable. So we kick the can in the future. But our demography is continuously, it is only a 20-year window. There'll be a rapid aging even in India. So all these are, larger concerns. I think it is going to be a difficult year, as I said in the beginning, those 3 macro contexts that I mentioned. But all said and done, despite all the concerns, OROP is a very good point made that have we learned anything by being somewhat populist? The army now the armed forces spend something like 1.3 lakh crores on pensions. The armed forces are spending more money to people who are at home than on active duty. There's more money spent on pensions and retirees than on people in armed active service. That's why we had to come out with creative solutions like Agnivir and Agnipath. So it's that the situation is that dire. Therefore, the space for modernization of the armed forces is narrowing. It's not even now 15%, 20%, or whatever. So these are the kind of fiscal challenges, but I thank you all for your patience and especially thank the panelists for excellent discussion. And we will, now I'll hand it over to Dr. Vishal and thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you, Ranade sir, for chairing the sessions. We were all just witness tremendous engaging morning and afternoon learnings and takeaways on the budget from these experts. Unfortunately, the event must end, but not before the round of applause and thank you. At the outset on behalf of Pune International Center and Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers. We look forward to many more engagements with you. Again, a special round of applause for our PIC staff and Gokhale Institute staff for their untiring support and the planning for that you put behind every event. My sincere thanks to all PIC trustees, members for attending this session today. Students, no event is ever complete without your interest and enthusiastic participant. Do continue to support our events. I also thank to our members of the media for your continuing and positive coverage of PIC and Gokhale Institute events. Last but not certainly least, Punekars and other in audience, we greatly appreciate your presence. So we have now come to an end of today's program. Thank you and wish you a great day ahead. Thank you. So I request photographers to have one